100 years ago, a newspaper claimed the average American got sick about once a year. It says about 40% of those illnesses were serious enough to put you in bed. But what did sick once a year actually mean in the 1920s? What counted as a normal illness? And how much of that normal was genuinely dangerous? Let's use one real newspaper chart as a time capsule, and then do the only fair thing. Translate it into modern terms and compare those numbers to today. This is Hidden Lens History, bringing the past back into focus. It's December 14th, 1927, and the Evening Star out of Washington runs the headline, "Average American Ill Once a Year." The chart comes from the U.S. Public Health Service, based on a study in a small inland city where households reported their illnesses over 28 months. And here's the number behind the headline. The paper says there were 1,050 illness episodes reported per year for every 1,000 inhabitants. So ill once a year wasn't an average per person. It was based off a ratio of reported illnesses versus people in the study. Then they add a line that gives the statistic a little more life. Roughly 40% of the illnesses were of sufficient gravity to require bed confinement. Hold on to that. We'll come back to it. But first we need to see what those illnesses actually were, because this chart, in some ways, is surprisingly familiar. At the very top, and it's not even close, colds and bronchitis, a massive chunk. Not glamorous, not dramatic, just constant respiratory crud, the kind that makes everything seem worse. Right behind that, influenza and grip. Grip was basically their catch-all for flu-like sickness. And then right up near the top, digestive system illnesses, stomach trouble, food trouble, something your body didn't like trouble. So a mountain of respiratory illness, a big slice of stomach trouble, and after that, a long tail of pain, inflammation, accidents, and everything else life could throw at you. But then the chart starts revealing where we are in time. Because tucked inside that long tail are names that land differently when you remember this wasn't a freak outbreak year. This was all normal. Measles, whooping cough, diphtheria, scarlet fever, typhoid. Not as headline events, not as once in a lifetime. Just there, in the mix, part of the average month. And there's another category on the chart that's very 1920s in the most human way possible. Confinements and other puerperal conditions. That's childbirth and postpartum complications, counted right alongside colds and sore throats. So this isn't just a chart about germs, it's a chart about what everyday life could do to you. Now go back to that 40% line because it helps us visualize what's going on. 40% required bed confinement doesn't mean they only counted the serious stuff. It means they counted everything, and nearly half of it still put people in bed. So sick once a year wasn't always a mild inconvenience. In the 1920s, an average year could flatten you for days. Which raises the real question, how does that compare to us? Quick caveat, we don't count sickness the same way anymore. This was household reporting episodes. Today, we're working with modern estimates and different definitions. So it's not apples to apples, but we can compare the shape. Start with the most boring truth. Respiratory illness is still the main character. Modern estimates commonly say adults catch multiple colds a year, and seasonal flu alone still hits millions of Americans in a typical year. The names change, the categories shift, but the idea that respiratory illness dominates the average year is stubbornly consistent. So what changed? Here's one answer. What those illnesses meant. Because in 1927, a bad week sick didn't just mean you felt gross. It could mean you lost wages, you lost work, you lost time you couldn't afford to lose. And sometimes, it meant something darker than that. Which brings us to the second big idea, just how dangerous was being sick back then. The article reports an annual death rate for that city around 9.3 deaths per 1,000 people. If you jump to recent US numbers, the overall death rate can land in that same neighborhood, roughly 9-ish per 1,000, depending on the year and how it's reported. Same looking number, totally different story. Because this newspaper graphic is an illness chart, not a cause of death chart. It doesn't tell us what those deaths were from. To understand the difference, you have to look at what was actually killing people in the late 1920s. And this is where the past feels both familiar and unsettling. Some of it looks modern already. Heart disease is at the top. Cancer is already top 3. That's the modern era arriving early, the long, chronic stuff. But then the list turns a corner. In the late 1920s, pneumonia and influenza are right up near the top of causes of death. Tuberculosis is still there, and sitting in the upper ranks are causes tied to the very beginning of life. Premature birth complications and gastrointestinal disease that could sweep through young children. That's the difference. The modern world was already showing up, but the older world was still hanging on. So the question hovering over an average cough back then wasn't only, how long will this last? Sometimes it was, will this take me to my grave? And now the chart reads like something else entirely. Not a quirky stat about once a year, a snapshot of what a society lived with. It's showing us that average sickness in that era had more weight to it, more consequences, more risk, more shadow. And just wait until you see the pages of ads selling fixes and cures to all these ailments. So what jumps out to you? What feels weirdly familiar? And what feels pure 1927? Drop one of each in the comments. And if you like these time capsules, that's basically what we do here. One old paper at a time.